So I would like to welcome everybody to the session. I am the graduate fellow for the DEI office, and this session will be, name of the session is the benefits of using a human rights rhetoric for climate change advocacy, right? And our session presenter today will be Ahmed Shafquat Hassan, right? And Ahmed is currently works at the Center for Peace and Justice as a research assistant. He was called to Bar of England and Wales in 2018 by the Honorable Society of the Inner Temple and was accredited as a civil and commercial mediator by the ADR/ODR International. During his academic career, he has won titles as a competitive debater and published multiple articles in national newspapers and political essays and reputable journals. So if everybody can welcome me and introduce and having Ahmed. And Ahmed, when you're ready, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Lovely to meet everyone here. Thanks for the very kind introduction. I'm gonna go ahead and just start the session, and I'm gonna have to share my screen if that's okay with everyone.
You're all set for screen share.
Can everyone see?
Yes.
All right. So benefits of using a human rights rhetoric for climate change advocacy. The reason we talk about this today is somewhat fairly obvious. Climate change has been, for now, one of the greatest threats to and one of the greatest global challenges that has been, that have brought terrible damages to biodiversity, ecosystems, and ways of life as we know it today. Surprisingly enough, the resolve to actually formulate effective solutions to this problem has been hindered by failures of effective legal frameworks, lawmaking, policymaking, governance, communications analysis, governance mechanisms, and just quite simply, there has been an overwhelming lack of political mandate in terms of how we choose to address climate change. So what do we do to respond to this problematic lack of mandate per se? The solution that I bring, or at least that I argue for, is dovetailing on the robust human rights discourse in order to advance climate change advocacy. The reason I say this is because the emergence of human rights-based discourse regarding climate change isn't something that's new and has shown to have significant impacts on how it's being dealt with across the globe. Moving on to the next slide. There are three key reasons as to why I think using a human rights discourse can help galvanize mandate towards climate change. One of the first aspects of this is moral centralism, the idea being that ultimately human rights enjoys a specific lexical priority beyond most other forms of rights-based discourse. And I believe that that allows us to have that moral higher ground to go ahead and argue in favor of climate change advocacy. The second thing I think is interesting is with a vast majority of human rights work, it's relatively easily adaptable. There exists a robust framework in the legal sense and in the sense of policy framing that we can dovetail onto. And using climate change, or at least viewing climate change from that lens, allows us to not only use the existing tribunal systems and the court systems to hold individuals accountable for the perpetration, as perpetrators, but also come up with sustainable policy framing that actually works to combat climate change on multiple grounds. But the last thing, and I think this is particularly interesting, it breaks the general straitjacket of climate change rhetoric and how it's seen at the moment. And it foregrounds climate change concerns by attaching itself to more of a human aspect. The reason I think that's relatively important is because at the moment, a vast majority of climate change advocacy is based off of the idea that the planet is being harmed, and it's centralized around more welfare solutions to that aspect. However, it does not talk about the harms and the impacts, or at least not to enough of an extent, where human beings are concerned. We do not focus our attention on the number of lives that are being individually impacted as a result of climate change and the myriad of problems that it brings with it. So the nexus, therefore, is something that we should ideally analyze, the nexus between human rights and climate change. Principally, quite simply, climate change impacts three categories of rights. You've got your civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights. And then you have the specific category of rights held by groups or individuals belonging to certain groups. So what do we mean by that? Number one, in terms of the civil and political rights, we've got concerns regarding Article 2 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that talk about having effective control and obligations over certain aspects of what your state does. So what do I mean? Whenever there are impacts of transboundary carbon dioxide emissions, there are specific obligations that are placed on states across the globe to manage or somewhat control whatever is under their effective control to ensure that it doesn't harm a third party. Effectively, what this means is whenever there's a violation of this obligation, that particular entity is in violation of civil and political rights, and that is done through something that's also contributing to climate change. The second thing that's interesting, and this impacts economic, social, and cultural rights, is where you have a loss of livelihoods, property, and access to culturally significant lands. You've got a number of people across the world, where I come from in Bangladesh, for example, living in
yes, whatever you can
forest lands near the south of the region, where because of massive levels of deforestation and actions that contribute to climate change, you've got individuals who are losing access to their livelihoods and to an area of land that they've called home for the longest time. Under the International Covenant of Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights, there is an impetus on governments and across the world, different nations, to protect individuals from losing out on accesses to these rights as well. The third thing, rights held by groups and individuals belonging to a certain group. The example right above is also quite transferable to the situation that's taking place in the Amazon rainforest on a lot of occasions as well. You've got individuals who are indigenous to that area who have had access to this land and rely on a very specific style of life based off of that particular domain, which is now being impacted as a result of a reduced access to that land. These are all actions that different nations are undertaking, and these are all actions that are ultimately contributing to climate change. And predominantly, it manifests itself as a threat to life, as a threat to health, and a threat to subsistence. As we've talked about, this impacts livelihoods for individuals in Bangladesh. It impacts lifestyles for a lot of individuals. As a result of climate change, you've got a lot of deadly diseases coming back into the surface. You've got a lot of viral vectors like mosquitoes who now find their ways in urban clusters in Dhaka city or in Delhi in India that continue to pose a threat to a lot of individuals across the world. So framing human rights in this way allows us for a streamlined response that is necessary, and it focuses on human impacts and dangers. What it also does is it creates a sense of urgency, because the moment you're talking about human lives being impacted, health being endangered, livelihoods being lost, you've automatically got a collective group of people who are then able to galvanize and talk to their policymakers to make the changes that are necessary. So why haven't we tried this before if this is so effective? Well, for a number of reasons. Typically, climate change impacts rights that enjoy the least amount of protection. Social and economic rights historically have enjoyed the least amount of protection. Most internal domestic mechanisms don't necessarily have strict stipulations as to where and to what extent a government or any domestic body needs to go to protect social and economic rights or the right to livelihoods. Additionally, these are also rights, in a lot of cases, belonging to migrants. These are individuals who often, by virtue of systems, get the least amount of protection, even when their rights are, at least on paper, protected. You then have the difficulty of identifying liability or individual perpetrators. Because of how climate change functions, you've got multiple contributors to the problem who've existed throughout a number of years now. So to be able to identify a single individuals, even under the human rights framework, to have contributed to this problem and then to hold them liable to a specific extent, because it's difficult now to quantify exactly the level to which that they've harmed someone. You will not be able to directly identify liability or individual perpetrators. Extraterritorial responsibility also results in jurisdictional challenges. These are also problems that exist within the human rights framework, in the sense that the typical understanding of a rights-based framework functions within a domestic system. And so long as there is that understanding of the domestic narrative, you're not going to have the ability of individuals coming up within that structure and actually being able to impose liability on individuals who exist outside of that structure. That is to say, me sitting here in Bangladesh cannot impose liability on someone living in the US for contributing to climate change or contributing to CO2 emissions. No matter how much I do that, there will be jurisdictional challenges unless I can bring this up to an international tribunal, and that in itself poses a series of problems. Something along the lines of whether the US is a signatory of any particular pact. We famously know that Trump backed out of the Paris Agreement. We famously also know that Biden recently jumped back onto this agreement. So there's always going to be that back and forth between international bodies who sign in and out of specific treaties, and that's going to pose these challenges. The other problem with this is resource dependency. In a lot of cases, responding to liability identification depends on being able to allocate resources to provide redress for the violations. That's often going to be challenged. What you also then have is a question of competing rights. I think the best example of this is when you have economic rights winning out over environmental rights. For example, literally any part of the world, government decides that they need to take out a large chunk of the forest in order to house a new power plant. It automatically means that individuals who depended on that forest for their livelihoods and so on and so forth automatically have to be disenfranchised and dislocated. And though this creates a number of jobs, and yes, there are certain economic benefits to it, the ultimate harm is still to the climate and to the environment as a whole. But the last, and to be fair, this is the least concern. Whenever it comes to human rights, historically and famously, they've been suspended whenever there's been an emergency, whether it be a natural disaster, whether it be a disaster as a result of human action. So for a number of reasons, we've typically shied away from associating climate change problems to human rights concerns, because what it means is there is that suspension, there is a series of these challenges jurisdictionally that we haven't necessarily figured out yet. However, I propose that needs to change, and the way we look at these things needs to change. So what are the benefits? Let's talk about this moral priority of using human rights, right? So it allows for greater consideration of a particular human problem. We talked about developing better and sustainable policy that garners political will towards climate change policy. Because we're suddenly focusing on the human impact, we're now able to get a lot more of the political power holders to care about individuals that are being harmed within their own constituencies or across the globe. Suddenly the talk is no longer about what's going to happen to the planet generations after we exist. It's now going to literally talk about what is happening to a human being living on the fringes of climate danger right now. And last but not least in this case, using the existing frameworks for better accountability. We understand that currently multiple government systems and multiple court systems are set up that respond to human rights mechanisms and human rights frameworks. What we propose to do in this case is use the legal framework of human rights laws to better obtain protections for those who are being impacted by climate change and the horrible human rights violations that come along with climate change abuse. So let's talk about this moral value of human rights. We talked about lexical priority, but what does that mean? When we talk about lexical priority in the sense of human rights, what we talk about is creating bare minimum thresholds. So what human rights perspectives typically tend to do is tell you that you can't harm a human being beyond X point, right? So quite famously, what this results in, or at least what the shape that it takes place, that it takes in most instances, is when you look at welfare nations like the UK, or to some degree the UK or Canada, or to a lot of the Nordic states that are famous for this particular form of conceptualizations, you've got human beings living at a socioeconomic level where they're provided for by the state. They're given a certain degree of economic benefits when they're unemployed. They're given a certain degree of protection from the state whenever there's a problem. What this means is that the state has managed to quantify and identify the bare minimum amount of income or redress that this individual needs as compensation for the structural, systematic disenfranchisement that this individual has suffered. The second thing that is interesting about the moral value of human rights is that there isn't universal conceptualization. That is to say that it belongs to all human beings and needs to be respected by all actors within the framework. While this might not entirely work out pragmatically in every case, at least that conceptualization allows us to understand what is owed to what is owed and unquestionably to all human beings. The last thing that we talk about, and why this is valuable, is when we talk about the concept of agency and or sovereignty. When we identify climate change, the problems of climate change as having an impact on the human rights of individuals living in other states, suddenly it's no longer just a discussion within your own domestic framework. It is a discussion across the globe about how violations or actions in a foreign state might end up and have spillover effects in your own state. What this means is that smaller groups are able to galvanize and collectivize on the global international platform to argue for their rights. An example of this is the creation of the Climate Vulnerable Forum for the United Nations Frameworks for Climate Change that is being held every year. COP26 is happening this year as well, where you have the CVF effectively collecting all island nations and climate vulnerable nations to argue in favor of actions that they need from the international community. This happens when you identify the problem that climate change brings with it, which is the disregard for agency and sovereignty. The last bit, we've talked about this before, and we talked about how liability identification is particularly difficult. However, that was in line with identifying climate change harms. However, if you've got bare minimum thresholds identified under the human rights framework, where you have an individual whose livelihood cannot be affected under X value, you're suddenly able to quantify liability. You're suddenly able to identify who, in this case, owes protections to this individual. Even in a situation where you cannot hold a private actor in a foreign jurisdiction accountable, you are able to hold your own government accountable to ensure protections for whatever degree of violations that you have to suffer through, or whatever degree you fall below that bare minimum threshold. The last, and again, not least, we talk about the hierarchical value of human rights. Because human rights functions in a way where you've got that hierarchical understanding of which rights are most important, and typically it's going to be the right to life, health, and subsistence again. You no longer have the ability to talk about economic trade-offs. That means when companies come around knocking at your doors, talking about deforestation, or talking about building large corporate structures in lieu of or exchanging specific land masses of forest lands, or impacting rivers that people depend on, that is no longer a discussion that the courts or the government will be able to have, because under a human rights framework and the moral valuation of human rights and the right to life in particular and subsistence, you would not have the ability to make that economic trade-off, because you are bound by your state and by your human rights identification to protect the rights of these individuals. It's a concern of framing more than it is a concern of how pragmatically this works out. In terms of policy adaptation, human rights lens allows this to become, the human rights lens proves often in many cases to be a good analytical tool for identifying minimum threshold harms and accountability. As we mentioned just earlier, when you have that bare minimum threshold, you are no longer able to make that cost-benefit analysis and that trade-off, which means when governments get together and make policy about development work over the next few years, they're no longer able to say, oh, let's move those indigenous people away from their lands so that we can build something there. They're no longer able to say, okay, we can pollute a certain area of the river in order to build a particular structure that benefits the economy. Because what that means is that that river that people are dependent on is no longer up for grabs, and it's no longer up for questions. The second thing that's important is the identification of vulnerabilities and addressing sensibilities. What this means is, in a lot of cases, when you've got impacts of climate change specifically impacting a vulnerable set of individuals, you're able to weave them into the threshold because suddenly their human rights are being violated, and it's a question of what they need in order to maintain a certain degree of life. Where did we see such an example? When Hurricane Mitch reached America, we had the individuals who were in the poorest income strata within that economic structure lose out as a result of Hurricane Mitch. They were deemed as most vulnerable, and their economic vulnerability lasted far longer than the impact of Hurricane Mitch on everyone else. So what does the government do in response? Having identified that these individuals have fallen below the economic threshold under the human rights framework within their own nations, these individuals were then invited to join the discussion as to how to shape policy to ensure that these individuals would be best protected coming up in the next few years. Last and not least, again, we talk about social justice. Engaging these individuals in that policy framework allows them to become a part of the fabric of policy development. But what does this get us even beyond this? Breaking out of that straitjacket of the focus on human rights, it draws on empathy. It gets more people to foreground the problem of climate change, and using that human rights footprint that has already impacted so many people across the world, that has become a part of one of the greatest discussions across the world, we are able to dovetail on that discussion to talk about how to best protect these rights. And not only that, interconnected human rights like the protection of freedom of speech allows climate change activists to go ahead and speak in favor of climate change advocacy. Talking about feminist rights, we talk about specific vulnerabilities of women as a result of climate change, and we get more people on board to join the train of protecting against climate change harms. Finally, and we move on to the last bit of the discussion. The advantages of having an existing framework. Understand that activists and jurists have often used the human rights framework in a lot of ways. In the famous case of Oscar Lopez versus Spain in the European Court of Human Rights, individuals were able to hold the Spanish government accountable to ensure that the government was doing the bare minimum necessary to ensure safe water flowed through the city so that people had access to clean water and therefore maintained the right to life. And again, this is an example of where individuals were able to use the human rights framework to protect themselves. This also shows an example of how states and different actors can be held accountable for the violations. What this also means is the moment that these cases are able to ultimately attention. The example of this is in the American Human Rights Council case for the Inuits, where the Inuit community was able to bring the case at least to the American courts. And even though that case was not successful, it managed to get a lot of media attention, and it managed to get a lot of people to start thinking about the harms of climate change. But ultimately, understand that 118 nations have adapted the right to environment sustaining right to environment sustaining as a prerequisite to enjoy the entirety of human rights values. And this comes in various forms in all of their constitutions. Not only is the environment seen as a precondition for human rights, but courts and tribunals are given the ability to interpret these environmental protections in line with human rights principles, and that adapts to multiple different treaties, and that adapts to multiple different policy work. And it engages and binds most states as a result of how different states are connected by virtue of their international platform and by virtue of various tribunals that already exist that are focused on protecting the human rights framework. The jurisprudence of this is relatively interesting, and I implore everyone to go ahead and explore this upon their own time. But having said that, what do we get? We talk about centralism today and how that can bring a myriad of benefits. We talk about the development of principles of accountability, inclusion, and sustainability. We've talked about developing safeguards, talked about generating discourse and attention, but most importantly, we talked about developing responsibility and cooperation. With that, I thank you for your time and for having me over today. And if anyone has any questions, I'll take them now. Thank you.
So, thank you for that, Ahmed. And like they said, we're opening up the space for the last 5 minutes of the session. There's a Q&A, so if there's any questions, you could drop it in the chat or you could unmute and ask.
Hi, my name is Ali Sayed. I teach at Bard BPI at the Brooklyn Public Library. And I just wanted to say that, your presentation was like really clear, really well laid out, really thoughtful. Would love to be able to review your presentation. I think there's so much information that it maybe might take a minute to synthesize, and would look forward to hearing more about how you're going to develop this further. Thanks for your presentation.
I'm really sorry, but that wasn't very clear because of the internet connection. What I can do is I'll type out my email address if you had any questions, and if you wanted to further evaluate the presentation, I'd be happy to talk to you about this at a later time. If anyone's got questions, I'd be happy to take them, especially if you can send it via text. That would be useful because I think the internet connection is a little bit unstable on my end. What you get for working out of your office. Yes, please, if Mazel Tov, if you could just write out the question, that'd be great.
Can you hear me? I have a question.
Anyone else in the meantime?
Can you hear me? I have a question.
Yes, I think you can ask it, yeah.
You can, okay.
I can hear you, but it's kind of breaking up.
It's delayed. Okay, I'm on my tablet, so it's kind of hard to
maybe
type.
If you say it, I could type it in there.
You could type it for me? Okay.
Yes.
So my question is, because we're using a human rights framework to talk about climate change issues, is there more vocabulary in the human rights framework to help us deal with the issue? Because climate change is more of a recent, well, not necessarily recent, but it's getting more recent attention. I'm trying to think of, like, because we have more vocabulary and more experience dealing with human rights issues, would that be a benefit that we have more vocabulary opposed to climate change where we don't have as much vocabulary to describe the issues that we're dealing with and address them?
Excellent question. I think, yes, to a large degree, the fact that we are more familiar with a human rights problem than a genuine climate change problem. The vocabulary does play a massive role in how people understand the impacts that it's having, right? So even in a court-based systems where you've got educated judges sitting up on a dais who are dealing with these things on a regular basis, it's a lot more impactful, and it makes a lot more, you go ahead and say, Your Honor, or ladies and gentlemen, or whoever is in front of me, the specific implications of action X is that not only does the river die or the river get polluted, but Fishermen who rely on the river to feed their families will no longer be able to do so, and therefore will lose out on the ability to not only make money, but feed their kids for the foreseeable future. That vocabulary, that use of language makes a massive difference in how climate change is viewed. And because the discourse around human rights has been developed in a way that it's meant to shock you, I believe that that gets specific benefits when you use that vocabulary as well. So excellent question, Noah Duquette. Am I saying that right?
Doucette.
Thank you very much. I've got a question from, sorry, pardon me. I've got a question from Mazel Tov. In what way constitutions can be amended in a way to include a relation of human rights with climate change? It's a very interesting question, because that is more of a question that centers around how we want to review constitutions. Number of issues relating to that. First, most nations aren't entirely keen on reviewing constitutions, at least not the main text. The second problem is that in the vast majority of cases, when you try to review constitutions, you need a significant political mandate, and in most cases, overwhelming. I don't see these sorts of amendments forthcoming within the next few years, but what I do see is, because most constitutions already have things like, for example, the fundamental right to life, Article 21 in the Indian Constitution. And that's been interpreted in multiple ways by judges to protect subsistence, health, so on and so forth. I don't see why that can't be done in order to protect it from climate change harms. So for example, if a judge was made aware of the human implications of, say, polluting that river, as from my last example, what it would then mean is that he would be morally obligated, not morally, even legally obligated to protect the subsistence of the individual dependent on said river by ensuring that the corporation who was going to pollute that river is no longer able to do so. So I don't think the constitutions can necessarily be amended within the way that we see this now. But in light of how human rights frameworks exist in most constitutions already, interpretations can certainly be made. And these interpretations are exactly what modern jurisprudence needs to talk about. John H. Knox makes an argument where you've got a interpretation which centers around the idea that judges would be able to identify the specific harms, but not necessarily fill in the substantial details about how these harms can be limited, but create procedural embankments to make sure that these harms or these actions can't take place. Two other questions. Dara Arad, can you explain how increased attention towards human rights has evolved internationally, and how climate change issues could benefit from being part of this? Well, over the years, the problem with how human rights has evolved and how human rights discourse has evolved is that it's quite been sensitive to the loss of life, but it doesn't necessarily talk about the overarching reasons behind the loss of life. It is the impetus of individual activists to go ahead and draw that narrative in that specific attention, which is what historically climate change activists have focused more on the science. I believe it's time now to focus more on the human implications of losing out on livelihoods, losing out on your access to lands, and so on and so forth. And I think that's the next step of the evolution for human rights discourse, certainly in conjunction with climate change discourse. A question from Brian Rodriguez. Are there other ways to fight against climate change that you didn't mention in the presentation? Imaginably there are. Honestly, because I think of my limitations as a lawyer, I am somewhat limited in how I think. Human rights being my main focus, I think that the discussion surrounding human rights is just important enough to get everyone's attention. The discourse surrounding the political implications of human rights violations gets a lot of attention. Every time you literally utter the words human rights, you've got a couple of heads turning and looking at either the government or the corporate entity or the individual who's violating these rights. And simply that comes across as years and years of conditioning because we've been told that it's such an important issue. Climate change didn't benefit from this. we're only realizing now the grave problems that has come with that from our own ignorance. The way we change that is by getting two narratives to work together. And that's the ultimate proposition that I bring today. Thank you everyone for your questions. I've attached my email address to the chat. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take them via email. And thank you everyone for having me today.
Yes. Thank you again, Ahmed, for your presentation. It was very knowledgeable. And I want to just remind everybody that there'll be a session evaluation that will be going out after this. So just take some time to fill that out. And normally we have a little 5-minute break, but we started a little bit later. So thank you for staying over. And I welcome you all to join another session. So thank you.
Thank you.